let me talk about Sarvodaya, not only because the boss said I should talk about it, but also because we need to start with Sarvodaya. You have all, many people are from India, some are from abroad. You have all heard about, oh, our creed is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Haven't you heard of that? Huh? Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is a family. Right? The world is a family. The earth is our home. The world is a family. You have heard about that. So in our old parliament, which was shaped like a temple from very interiors of Madhya Pradesh in Morena, and now it's a different parliament shaped like I do not know what. But I would not like to say what, but anyway. But the old parliament was a round building which had no corners, like love should not have any angles. So it had no angles really. And there was something written outside. I don't think any parliamentarian had read it. Or even if they had read it, they hadn't thought about it and they never followed it at least. Because Mahatma Gandhi says that keep away from the parliament. But it had written outside because we had a great thinker, almost a philosopher as the first prime minister. So he chose it, and the shloka is from the Kathopanishad, and it says, I'll say it in Sanskrit because it's easier for me, my brain to work on the translation. As you know, I don't come thinking about what I'm going to talk anything before I come to the stage, so my brain has to do a little extra work. So the shloka is, Ayam nijah parovetti gananam lagu chetasam. This is mine, Ayam nijah parovetti, that is yours. This is the thinking of small minds. Ayam nijah parovetti gananam lagu chetasam. So this is mine and this is yours. This is the thinking of small minds. Udar charitanam tu, for those of the magnanimous heart. Udar charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. The world is a family. For Udar Charitanam, for those of the magnanimous heart, for those of the large heart, the world is a family. So how does the world become a family? You have to have a large heart before that. So there's a condition for that. It's not that the world is just a family naturally, organically. It's not. It's not. You can see there is a term called Matsya Nyaya in Indian philosophy, which means that, and then there's a very interesting shloka on that there is this sea on which there is as Timinama Matsara, Timingil Gilopyasti, Tad Gilopyasti Raghava. So this small fish is eaten by the big fish, and then the big fish is eaten by Raghava, Sri Ramchandra, because he was a prince. He was not a vegetarian, remember? Whatever people tell you, he was not a vegetarian. So what the point is that this is the natural order of things is parallel realities. We do not have completely nice people. We do not have completely not nice people. Because the circumstances that come to individuals are dictated by socio-economic factors. And we have to understand that. The world can be ideal. It can be, but we do not need to be, inconsistently idealistic. You have to remember, when we laud motherhood, when we, make heroes of mothers, when we make beautiful poetry about the relationship between the mother and the child, do we remember that there are mothers who are unwilling? And they are not only those mothers who have suffered violence, who have been raped, who have been treated badly. They are not those mothers only. There are mothers who have been pushed into marriages against their will. There are mothers who never went to school, or if they went to school, they never went to college, or if they went to college, they never got the option of their own growth, the choice of their own career, their own life, and then they become mothers. How happy are they? There are mothers in India and beyond India who keep having children waiting for a son. Right? Even though the Sanskrit word for children is santan, and santan does not have any gender. Even so, India loves boys. Asia loves boys. Africa loves boys. Even Europe loves boys. And America, of course, loves only white boys. And by America, I mean United States of America. Sorry, I should have said United States. So the thing is that when we think of motherhood as something precious and beautiful, we must look at the mother also. We are looking at the child, and it's beautiful to look at the child. And Maria Montessori started this whole movement, and I'll come to her a little later, of looking at the child, understanding the child, being with the child, learning from the child. But let us look at the mother, who probably has had no childhood, who has had a life which began with responsibility, because she is a woman, she is a girl. It began with responsibility. It began with expectations, loads of expectations on her shoulders. And that expectation she bore with a lot of fortitude and a lot of patience, because that was her virtue. And I don't know whether that's a natural virtue or whether it's an imposed virtue. So therefore, when we come to think of this whole world as a family, this earth as a home, we have to think about that person who hasn't ever been given the opportunity. And that opportunity of being who she is, denied to her, brings her into the lowest frame of human existence. And that is not related to your finances, that is not related to your caste system, your class system. It is only related to whether you had the option, whether you had the playing field. And so, when we think of Sarvodaya is something which I need to tell you that it is a word coined by Mahatma Gandhi. It sounds very ancient, doesn't it? But it appears once in a medieval Jain text, but Mahatma Gandhi did not take the reference from there initially. He moved towards Jain philosophy later. Sarvodaya comes from Mahatma Gandhi's translation of a very interesting book called Unto This Last by John Ruskin. Mahatma Gandhi, I think we can keep a cup of warm water there. Thank you so much. So Unto This Last is a book by, and so there is, in the 19th century, actually from the 18th century, the world started veering towards this economy of banks and insurance companies, where very ordinary people keep their little ordinary money to make some people, a few, or just a handful of them, very rich, And this whole idea of economics, where your savings, your very little, meager savings, unless you're coming from, a very Zarinanti, very rich Parsi background, your meager savings will go and finance a bank. The banks in India or in many countries were nationalized much later. They were all private banks, They were all, the insurance companies which put fear of death into you in the beginning. It was started by a Scottish person. I do not know why the Scottish people, who are not very rich generally, I do not know why they decided to do this, but I think the guy thought that it'll be good if you just put fear of God, fear of death in them. And so in the fear of death, people started saving this money for their families. There's nothing wrong with that now, you feel. But what happened was that slowly these whole systems of accumulating hardworking people's money into the hands of some very crafty individuals or groups of individuals came. And so this disparity started coming. There was the only disparity before that was between the landowners and the landless. The serfs, the feudal system had a different disparity, but this financial system created a different kind of disparity. where you were liberated from being a serf in a feudal lord's property, and you thought that you got a job, maybe in a factory or wherever you got a job or became a clerk, and you started earning some money, but even that money is not really in your hands. So, and that money is enriching someone else. So there was a lot of reaction to this. So John Ruskin, even before that, people like Leo Tolstoy and all, they were thinking about reacting to this kind of economy, this kind of exploitative economy, which accumulated wealth in a few hands and made the general populace lacking. Unto this last is about this. It's also a very conservative book in many aspects, and Mahatma Gandhi brushes over that, but he picks up this idea of giving respect to all work. Somebody who's cleaning the streets is doing as much valuable work as you are doing it when you are educating, you're teaching mathematics in the class. So, I mean, I'm saying this very simplistically. So this, this idea of work being equal, people being equal, and respect to each person, he called it Sarvodaya. Sarva means all, and Udaya means rising. Udaya, the word means rising, but what Mahatma Gandhi translated it as welfare of all. So Mahatma Gandhi, the thing about Mahatma Gandhi is that he is not a philosopher who theorizes. He is a philosopher, he's given us a philosophy, but he doesn't theorize. What he does is he practices. As I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, he has done things like, taking a bullet in his heart. I mean, it's the beyond practice. George Orwell writes about him, and George Orwell was not a Gandhian, he was not even a pacifist. He actually went to fight the war in Catalonia. He's written a good book about it, and he got shot through his neck and just survived and wrote the two greatest books of our times, 1984 and Animal Farm. But he writes that Mahatma Gandhi was on a pilgrimage. And a pilgrimage is not a passive thing. And whatever he did was an activity. So in Sarvodaya, and I'm not talking about the Indian independence movement for which he used Sarvodaya, he had something called the constructive program. And the constructive program is interesting in that he talks not only about all aspects of human reality, of the Indian society. He's focused on Indian society, and it's a good thing to be focused on what you can actually have an impact on. So he was focused on Indian society in South Africa, he was focused on Indian society in India. Before that, he tutored himself well about that. He traveled all over India, and you know all those stories. I'm not going to tell you those general stories which are available on the internet. But what he was worried about was the aspect of darkness which was there in Indian lives. And he did not blame the British for it. He blamed the inertia of a very ancient civilization. Irini is not here, and she knows from her life in Greece, if she was here, she would agree with me, that in all these so-called ancient civilizations, which are very conscious of their ancientness, whether it's Egypt or India or Greece or even China, there is this lethargy of coming out of what they think are their traditions. This is probably true for Europe also. I did not know this about Europe. I used to think that Europe is, they are all Christians, and so they have these churches and they have these prayer systems, except for, I do not know why I did not think of Greece as part of Europe, but I thought of Europe like that. But when I started traveling more in Europe, I discovered that Europeans have their own ancient traditions. And those ancient traditions have been superimposed by religion, but those ancient traditions and those aspects of life, whether they are Irish, or whether they are Scandinavian, or whether they are German, or whether they are Italian, they survive. I mean, Italy, in the very home of the Pope, the Italians North Italy has this tradition, South Italy has this tradition. So most of these old civilizations, consciously or unconsciously, stick to their divisions. stick to their, as Nandita Das was talking about, lots of divisions, and some natural, some created. Now these divisions are they create a darkness in the soul. And so when Mahatma Gandhi went to Champaran for the first time, and if, just a minute, I had to ask a question. How many people were born here in this hall, were born after 1981? Goodness. How many were born after 1997? Yeah, so some generation Z as you like to call it, and many millennials. I should address you first. I'm sorry about the people who were before 81, like me. So then I have to tell you that if you want, you can visit Google uncle or auntie, whichever way you look at the creature, and find out about the Champaran Satyagraha. You know that Gandhiji called all his movement Satyagraha, the insistence upon truth, right? So when he went for the Champaran Satyagraha, it was the first one after he returned from South Africa, and he had toured the country in a third-class cabin, and then he had also almost changed his garb. He waited to go to Madurai, to Tamil Nadu, to finally completely become the Indian farmer, the poor Indian farmer. But before that, he nearly had changed his garb. When he went there, Kasturba went to visit. Kasturba was always with him. Kasturba went to visit the women of the village, because the women of the village were in Parda. So she went to a house. Many of you, especially people before 81, would have heard this. But after 81, if you're history students, you would know maybe. Not history students now, but history students before. So she went there, and in that little hut, she said, how many women are here in this house? They said, we are 3 sisters-in-law. She said, I would like to talk to all of you. They would come one by one. She said, well, I want to talk to all of you, all 3 of you together, because the children were so smelly because they wouldn't even take a bath properly. So she wanted to teach cleanliness, hygiene to everyone together. So the woman said, how can we come together? We have only one sari between us. So this was the darkness in the soul of India. And all the men had a dhoti each. They had a dhoti each, but the women. Now I'll tell you something which my own grandmother told me. How Mahatma Gandhi used the charkha for Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya involved giving work to every hand. Sarvodaya involved respect for all work. And so he was a bit of a dictator. You know, most of these kind of philosophers, prophetic people are. So he said, you know, everybody is going to ply the charkha and make some yarn. I have known orthodox Gandhians, yes, Gandhians can also be orthodox, who will only wear handspun. My own grandmother did. She only wore handspun. And so he said that everyone is going to ply the charkha and bring the yarn to the khadi bhandar. Everyone knows khadi. I hope nobody is here who doesn't know what khadi is. Yeah, handspun cloth. So the khadi bhandar, the shop for khadi, for handspun cloth, was where you would bring the yarn. And everybody means every person involved in the national struggle, whether it is a man or a woman or whatever. So everyone would spin the yarn, bring whatever yarn, and would get their half anna, max 25 annas, whatever, 1 rupee from the khadi bhandar. And only those people would get it who had themselves spun it. So my grandmother used to say, I don't know, some of you might have heard this from me earlier. My grandmother used to say that there were women who had never seen money. Because all buying, purchase was done by men in the house. So even their saris for their festivals, like in In our area, Durga Puja is a very important festival and everybody must wear a new sari on Ashtami or Navami day, whichever day they choose. So that sari for Durga Puja would be bought by the man in the house. It probably would be just a white sari with a red border, and later on, if she wanted to make it a little varied, she would dip it in turmeric and make it yellow or whatever. So this was done by men. No purchase. The women of most women, unless they were, and there were very few women laborers who were then, if they were laborers working in the farm as farmhands for sowing of paddies usually, at that time, those women would be given their cloth by the men who employed them. So it was always men who gave, who had the power of purchase. So she said that, you know, when the first time these women were given these coins in their hands, they would kiss it. They would touch it to their eyes. They would touch it to their cheeks, and they would weep. They would hold it in their palms like a baby, and they would weep because this was the first time they had seen money and this money was theirs. Can you imagine disempowerment to that extent? And can you imagine the impact that this Gandhian program had on the empowerment of women? You do not know this, but your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, not your grandmothers, you're too young, your great-grandmothers did not have power of purchase. And this power of purchase is what makes you empowered. Actually, you might have all the power in the world, but I'll tell you, you can't buy anything, nothing. I will give you your clothes, I will give you your food, I will give you this. That is patriarchy. That's exactly what patriarchy is. And the patriarchy can be actually womaned by a senior old matriarch. You know, a woman who buys into this power game. It's a power game. It's the powerful telling you what you can do and what you can't do, what you can wear, what you can't wear, what you can eat, what you can't eat. So this is one of the aspects of Sarvodaya started by Mahatma Gandhi, financially, economically empowering every person in the Indian society. And this was begun by this movement, the Sarvodaya movement. He started it by making his own ashrams. One of the first ashrams that he made was in South Africa. You know about that. It's called Phoenix Ashram. It is still there, and there are still, and you can go to Durban, and from there there's the Inanda slum. It will break your heart to see that the Inanda slum is still the Inanda slum. You have a Gandhi living right there in an ashram, including everyone, whichever color you are, you know. And colors are only shades, honestly. All human beings are the same color. They are all shades. And all those shades of colors are there. His granddaughter, Ila Gandhi, still works there. She's in her mid-80s now, and she's still working there. Her own husband was with Nelson Mandela. Her child, he's the only other Gandhi martyred by the colonial powers. Her own child was killed by the apartheid police when they came to search for her husband in her house. And so she's there and she's working there, and those ashrams are going on. Later on, what are these ashrams? They're there in your own Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, all over India. India is dotted with these Sarvodaya ashrams. What are these ashrams? These ashrams are not NGOs. They are grassroots organizations which work for the people of India without looking at the government. So the people fund the people. The people fund their own change makers. How do they do that? Like in Ekta Parishad, I noticed that every village has these 2 pots. You put 1 rupee inside the pot per day, 1 rupee per day, and you put a fistful of rice in another pot. So whenever you have a movement, say you have to go and do a sit-in at the collectorate for some land rights or water rights or whatever, you have 360. Say there are about 100 people in that village, 100 families in that village. You have 100 rupees per day. In an year, you can see how much money you make. It's a very micro collection system. And then you also have that rice. And they can go and do their sit-ins for a month or so with that. every year. So these are, and many people have devised different types of ways to finance themselves. But the important part is that they do not look at the government or any powerful organization for doing their programs. And what are their programs? There are, in Tamil Nadu alone, there are about 150 schools for rural girls run by an organization, a Sarvodaya-based organization called ASEFA. And ASEFA runs about 150 schools for girls. I am only a witness there. I have not participated there. The Gandhigram University gives them expertise, and these schoolgirls are from all communities, all castes, whichever are available in that area. And these schools work on the principle of Nai Talim. You know what Nai Talim is? Nai Talim is the new education which it is also part of Mahatma Gandhi's Sarvodaya philosophy. Nai Talim is inspired by people like, I would say also Pestalozzi, but Maria Montessori mostly, because Mahatma Gandhi met her. He had read about her, but he met her in 1931 in London when he went for the Round Table Conference. You know about that. I think it must be part of your curriculum when he visited. It should be if it is not. When he visited, and his reaction about what he saw Maria Montessori doing with the children. And it really inspired him. He crafted it to the rural, very poor, almost destitute Indian reality. And so he started this, and he says, he actually picks up her words when he says that Nai Talim must involve the head, hand, and heart. And he picks it up, and he just crafts it a little more for those children when they grow up to have some vocational training, to find some, because it is focused more on livelihood. When you look at rural India, and as I told you, the darkness around there, it is more focused. Nai Talim is more focused on livelihood rather than just on the personality. Of course, personality development from the childhood till getting to that point where where the young person can have an option of a livelihood. So Nai Talim is inspired by Maria Montessori. Maria Montessori is inspired by Gandhi later on when she meets him, and particularly when she comes and stays in India and starts corresponding with him. And it was a lucky chance for India that the British, in their madness, arrested her and kept her here. I do think that we should thank them for this, because honestly, this absolutely mature, I wouldn't say things like wonderful, amazing, all those things can be said by my Gen Z, sorry, I don't like Z people, but it is basically a very mature system. And yesterday, Irene and I were talking about why this is not just a philosophy. It is actually an idea which occurred to this doctor who was a doctor of children, a psychologist who was looking at children, and a mother who had a child whom she needed to hide for a bit and still make him grow up as a person useful for the world, because she wanted to be useful for the world. She was such a revolutionary, and this revolutionary woman, there are some people who come to tear the fabric of time. There is this fabric of time which is there, which looks like one whole stretch, but some people come and tear it. And some fools then try to stitch it back. But Maria Montessori tore it. Lots of fools have been trying to stitch it back, but I'm so happy that you all entered that tear in that fabric of time. And you're right there with her on that fabric of time. Because she is the most mature eye on education. And yesterday a lot was spoken on education, so I'm not going to talk a lot on education. But what I'm trying to connect it with is Sarvodaya. Montessori is a huge part of the Sarvodaya thought. Because she herself, she did not focus on looking at financial privilege as someone who could enter Montessori, or as Zarina clarified yesterday, that materials are not Montessori. You know, it's the idea, it's the inner spirit. And it was beautiful when Irene said about spirit that it is not only the breath of life, but also the connection that the community has, the ecosystem that you have within yourself to connect with each other and live like an organism. And like all organisms need nourishment. I really loved when this yesterday. She said that like all organisms which need nourishment, a community needs nourishment. And the best nourishment that the community can have is education of its children, preparing of the community to be with the child as the child grows, as the child discovers, to be a part of that absolutely beautiful, wonderful, revealing world. You know, when that, you be open when the creation is coming alive, to quote one of the popular songs of my youth. So this creation coming alive is something which is part of the Sarvodaya thought. And so Sarvodaya doesn't leave anyone behind. Sarvodaya takes everyone together. And that brings us to the idea of Ubuntu, you know, and which is there because I'm here because we are here. You are there, I'm there, we are here. Now these are all principles which have been there, right there, since ancient times. And the basic reason that this exists is the second part, as our young friend asked me to talk about, ahimsa. The idea of Sarvodaya, the practice of Sarvodaya cannot exist without ahimsa. Now when you think of ahimsa, lots of us think about, and you do think about complete pacifism. Ahimsa is non-violence, and you think of non-violence as pacifism. How many people think that non-violence means when somebody slaps you on your cheek, turn your other cheek around? Lots of you do, and lots of you think, oh, it's very impractical. Even Jesus has said this in context. Go back and check it. Because Jesus is not a passive, non-violent person. Mahatma Gandhi used to say that he made a ransom of himself for us. And the pacifism of Jesus is active. This whole context of his entering Jerusalem, and he is coming to, and you can check it in many versions, and all versions except for one maybe, tell you, and I have read the King James version, so I must apologize before you if you have read something else. But he enters with his friends, and he enters there, and when he comes to the temple, he actually throws out, without beating up anyone, and that's a wrong thing if you think that he beat up anyone, he tells everyone to get out of the temple because he says this is a place of worship. The house of my Father, the Lord, is a place of worship, not a place of commerce. So he pushes out the moneylenders and the wine sellers and whoever is there. He tells them, please get out because this is not a place for commerce. This is a place. I don't know if we can do that in our places of worship now. Most of our places of worship of any religion have become such a commercial place, haven't they? They have become tourist spots rather than actually places of worship. So, non-violence, this word, let me look at the word ahimsa for a bit. Ahimsa means hinsa means hurting, hurting physically, basically. But let us look at later on when it develops, it becomes something more. So basically it starts, the Sanskrit word himsa is like it's used for a tiger who's a himsra pashu. Himsra means one who goes and bites people, cuts people, harms people. So he's a himsra pashu, himsra animal. Now ahimsa is a very old ancient concept, but it is not a concept which came as it is. It has been developed. So when you go to the Vedic times, you will find that ahimsa is, they are still arguing about what it exactly is. So they're looking at human beings not beating each other up. But later on, Jainism brought it up to the hilt when they thought of even plants as things which, if you need to eat them, you eat them, otherwise you don't eat them because you don't harm them. So this whole idea of extreme ahimsa is a part of the of what we call, what the ancient tradition calls the Shramana tradition. The Shraman tradition is a tradition of thought which is, which basically means you become an ascetic. You leave the daily purchase of life. Therefore, you will see very few Jains engaged in agriculture. Most of them are engaged in trade because agriculture needs some violence. Now, human beings would not have survived just with trade. What are you going to trade in? So therefore, ahimsa very practically has been slowly, it developed into something which is least harm to anyone else. Now, because ahimsa is not pacifism, and war is not something which is completely avoidable, so therefore, you have this Latin concept of just war, jus bellum. So when just war means there are certain conditions of just war. Somebody has attacked you, somebody has attacked what you think is your nation, somebody has attacked a vulnerable group of people, then you need to protect them. Even Mahatma Gandhi says that he has got 18 chapters of Gita in a book called Gita Mata, and it's a book which is very interesting because there are questions, people come and talk to him and question him on concepts of the Gita, and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana both have wars in it, and they're talking of wars for justice. But the most important impact which the concept of ahimsa had was from Bhagwan Buddha, from the Buddha. Buddha is an amazing thinker. He's again a very practical thinker. But he is talking because he is from the Sarvodaya movement, Buddha. He is not looking at people who have power. He is looking at the powerless. He is promising women nibbana. He is not cutting off anyone. So therefore, he has to think of the butcher. He has to think of the plowman. He has to think of the woman who is cleaning and cutting. So Buddha gives the option of livelihood, which is essential, and then living it with the right attitude. Buddha talks of the right attitude towards things. So without attachment, without getting into the real, like saparya, real advantage of the situation, Buddha talks of that. And so this is why we come what Jenny was saying yesterday, that you have to look at, if you're looking at a poor person, you're aware of it, but you don't need to accept it. And I really loved when you said that awareness of disparity does not mean acceptance of disparity. And this is what Buddha is talking of. You be aware that there's disparity. You be aware that there are people who are absolute have-nots. But you be aware, you do not think of yourself as someone who's, what can I do? What is in my hands? If Maria Montessori had thought that, we would not be here today. Because these are people, as I told you, who break the fabric of time. War or no war, I have seen human beings being human. I'll tell you an incident from my training days when we were at the Akhnur border. It's in Jammu area. It's just, you know Vaishno Devi. Everybody knows Vaishno Devi. It's just behind the hill of Vaishno Devi, and it's on the border, and there's the river Lidar going between India and Pakistan. And there was no war at that time, and this was 1991 when we went for our exposure to the border, and it's called the army exposure. We were in bunkers, they were also in bunkers. In the morning, because they used to be supplied arms by the policemen of the world. So they needed to dispense some of it, because then how would the new supply come? So they would call out, Sathi, and our guys from here said, Ha, Sathi. You know, friend? Yes, friend. Go inside your bunker, don't come out brushing your teeth. Because many people would go by the riverside to brush their teeth and, generally waddle in the river. And so he said, go inside. Why? Because we are putting on the GPMG, that is a general purpose machine gun, which has a long string of bullets. So all the Indian soldiers would go inside their bunkers, and the Pakistani soldiers would just put the strap, and then it would go tuck, 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 whatever, 500, 1,000. And then when it was over, they would say, Sathi, bahar aa jao. Friend, come out. Then they would come out, and, there would be, conversations, and what happened, and do you have any letters, what's happening at home, did your cow give the calf that it was supposed to give the calf, and things like that, because most of our soldiers are people from very, very ordinary, poor, rural backgrounds. So they have a cow at home, and they have a mother who is not well, and things like that, both sides. And they were talking, and I wrote about it, and I still feel that the soldier has no stake in the war. The soldier has no interest in the war. The soldier is there because the soldier is trained like that. The soldier is fighting the war for somebody who's going to gain out of it, somebody who's making weapons somewhere in the more powerful part of the world. Now even we are trying to do that in the land of Shanti and Ahimsa and Sarvodaya, unfortunately. So this is the core of a human reality, where they want to be friends when there is an opportunity, when there is an atmosphere. They want to be nice to each other when there is a possibility to be nice to each other. As Montessori teachers, are we thinking of ourselves as the possibility, not the creators of the possibility. We are the possibility. We are the possibility of creating that beautiful world which is full of love, which is full of that position where we can say to the person with the machine gun right in front, friend, Sathi, are we there? We need to be aware of that beautiful chance which the rule breaker, which the history changer, Maria Montessori brought in for us. We do need, all of us have some of these people there who just take all risk upon themselves and create this situation, create this atmosphere, and give us this opportunity. I am absolutely sure that we are all there. And between our, the ahimsa, which is active non-violence, not passive non-violence, not sitting there and giving your cheek out of context. Ahimsa, which is recognition of everyone. There is no other. Where is the other? Isha vasyamidam sarvam yatkinch jagatyam jagat. Whatever is there in this world is just divine. So where is the other? There is no other. So therefore the acceptance of yourself is the acceptance of every self. And I'm absolutely, and this is one place where I only get absolute positivity. And there is an absolute positivity. I get absolute positivity. Thank you so much for listening to me.